Cool. Hello, everybody. We're going to let the session fill up a little bit with folks still joining. We'll get going here in just about a minute. Okay, looks like we have some people joining, which is fantastic. Excited to get started here. Happy you all could join me for this session. I'm going to be getting into writing and coding labels for accessible web applications. Stoked that many of you are interested to learn how to make your web pages, web applications more accessible. My name is Matt Gregg. I'm a senior principal user experience designer here at Blackbaud, and I'm based in Charleston, South Carolina. And I want to start with a short story, just comparing how 3 different people experienced this donation form that you see on the page here. The first is Eliza. So she's a new 6th grade teacher, and she prefers really being on and completing most of her online activities on her phone, so she can do this kind of from anywhere. And she has an experience that many of you might relate to, where she pulls up the donation page. She wants to give some money to one of her favorite charities. She sees the page on her phone. She sees the form. She sees the options. She taps into the fields that she sees on the screen. Her keyboard comes up. She completes the form. Pretty easy peasy. Next person is Rod. So Rod is retired from a job just recently, after working for about 40 years. He's also developed Parkinson's disease, a central nervous system disorder that has been causing him some muscle rigidity and some muscle tremors in his upper extremities. So enough so that he often can't use a mouse or a keyboard because of some of the shaking in his arms. But he's adapted. He's learned how to use voice control, which a lot of his devices have. And he really tries to avoid using a mouse or his keyboard as much as possible. He really relies on using his voice to be able to control his devices. So when he starts to make a donation, he says, "Click first name." Ugh, nothing happens. So he gets to his keyboard. He's able to put his cursor into the fields, says his name, which enters his details, and then he continues on, kind of continues this way slowly, kind of a combination of his keyboard and his voice, dictating his input through his voice. Next, he says, "Click $100. Ugh, nothing happens. At this point, he's frustrated. He's tired. He decides it's just not worth it, and he's going to take off. Then there's Calandra. She's a masseuse and has been living with diabetes for many years. And recently, she's developed some diabetic retinopathy complications that has damaged her retina a little bit. So causes her to see some spots, and has also given her some significant blurring in her vision. So it's gotten to the point where she started to use a screen reader, which reads out the text to speech on the screen to really aid her. So she can kind of see the shapes and colors on the screen, but she can really hear it at the same time. It really helps her understand pages much better. So when she lands on the page, she navigates to those input fields, but all she hears is that they're text fields. So she decides to explore a little bit further, get a better sense of maybe what's here, to figure out what's going on. And she sees some other text on the page. There's some amounts that she can give, but she's not sure of the amounts. And she's also hearing there's a place where she can also enter in an amount. She's not really sure what's going on in the area and decides he just doesn't have time to figure this out right now. And takes off. So why did Rod and Calandra have such bad and kind of different experiences than Eliza? And really, why did this donation form only get 1 out of the 3 donations that it could have? So while Eliza relies on seeing the user interface and being able to interact with pointing devices like her finger or a mouse, Rod and Calandra rely on something else entirely, actually. So they and other assistive technology users rely on a different layer of your application to access and interact. So you can think of this with your application as actually having 2 kind of user interfaces. One for users who are viewing the page on the screen, interacting with it via a mouse and the keyboard or other pointing devices. And then there's another for users who are using assistive technology. And they rely on how the DOM and the document object model that you see on the right here is constructed in the HTML itself. So they're able to understand and interact with your web page via a browser, which you can see here on the right, kind of takes that DOM and it builds what's called an accessibility DOM or the accessibility tree that you might hear. And that's what then the platform's accessibility APIs, so think Android and Mac OS and Windows. They all have a different accessibility API. That's what they interact with. So when Rod uses voice control, he's going through all those different layers to interact with the accessibility DOM in your page. So then while visually Eliza can kind of see and understand the donation form via kind of the things she sees via the different names, the different roles, she can kind of tell by what they look like, what their labels are, the different spatial relationships that she can see. When this information is missing from the DOM, assistive technology users like Calandra and Rob are going to have a much different type of experience and potentially not be able to even use it in the extreme cases. So some examples here, kind of starting at the top. So instead of maybe understanding that's a back button, if that's been coded with kind of a less than symbol, that's all they might hear. And visually, Eliza can see that those are tabs at the top for an individual or a company. If those are really just represented as links, someone like Calandra might actually hear that those are links and might think that's going to take her someplace else. And then down at the bottom, there's options for frequency. Those aren't actually coded to be options and maybe just text. Assistive technology users aren't going to know those are actually selections that they can make. So for people who use assistive technologies to have a good kind of usable experience with your web page or your application, they need this layer of semantic information in the DOM or the document object model. So for user interface components on the page, there's kind of three key pieces of information to provide. One is the role, kind of what is this? Is it a button? Is it an input? And then the name, what's the purpose of that button or the function of that button and on your particular page. And then lastly, states and properties. So other things that kind of can tell someone maybe what state something is in, if it's selected or if it's expanded. And all the many different elements have a number of these, but that's kind of the third type of information that's important to provide. So in the example we just looked at, you can see how this plays out here, where at the top of the screen, you have that set of tabs, which is a tab set, and it can have a name. So I'm donating as, and then a tab set. And similarly, the tabs within it can also have roles and names as well. So a company will be a name for the tab, or an individual will be a name for the tab. So in this talk, it's really what I'm going to focus on, the names. And we'll get into how to do that here in just a minute. But I just wanted you to know that we're going to focus on names. It is important to think about these other two pieces of information as well when you're building out your markup. So make sure that not just the names included, which we'll get to, but that certain roles the elements have on the page are included, and their different states and properties as well, so that people who use assistive technologies can have a great experience, just like someone who's visually using the page and interacting with it with a mouse or other pointing devices as well. So that really gets us to our agenda and the meat of this. So we're going to get into next kind of what needs a name, now that you know a little bit about how they're used by assistive technology, how to code or mark up those names, how to choose or write good labels and names. And then lastly, I'll wrap up with how SkyUX can start to help with some of this as well. So one thing to note, though, along the way, I'm going to be showing some code examples in some of the slides. I just wanted to point out, if you look at this later or as we go through it, know that these aren't complete. So they really only include the bits that are important for naming or the visual labels. They're not a kind of complete code example. They would include markup to really make it function, or even to make them completely accessible. So just be aware of that as you might look at this later or as we go through it right now. So initially, why are names important? As you can maybe guess from some of the examples I just talked about, but here they are. The first is they really communicate visual-only content sometimes. So things such as images, charts, icons, progress indicators. If those don't have an equivalent in text, there's nothing for someone who, say, uses a screen reader to hear what's on the page, for them to really understand what that is. Secondly, they provide wayfinding assistance to really identify a place or an action within the page. And then they also help differentiate between similar elements, so someone can understand that this heading or this button is different from another one by having different names. And then lastly, they allow for voice control. So in the case of Rod, which I talked about just a second ago, they really allow that direct interaction with the page, so someone to be able to control their browser and ultimately your web page via their voice. But not everything needs a name. There are many elements that do require names to be able to be usable, many that can also have them. And there's a long list of these from the W3C, and I've provided, I think if you can get this, download this PDF later, there's some resources down at the bottom, or if you can't, I'm actually not sure if you can, but definitely feel free to reach out to me. I can send this to you later. Provide a couple of resources to see all of those, but you can generally think about them and what needs an accessible name in three buckets or three groups. So the first are kind of non-text elements, things I just mentioned, like images, charts, icons. The second are the kind of the focusable and interactive elements. So think about different form controls or links or buttons, but then also tabs or menus, things that maybe aren't defined or maybe might not have seen as much in just regular HTML, but can be added as particular more rich interactive roles on a page. And then lastly, wayfinding elements. So think about marking up areas to identify the location. So certain headings on the page or landmarks. And think about these also as kind of the containers. So frames and dialogues or groups that you might have. Those are important to name so that someone can, essentially navigate to them directly, or when they come across them in the web page, they know exactly what they are. So those are the elements that need names. Next, I'm going to go through some of the coding and markup techniques for how you actually give some of those elements a name for assistive technology users in a page. So the first rule of thumb is to utilize native HTML first. You don't need to do anything special or different. Elements get their accessible names via you as an author, really just by setting it directly in some cases, or by being set in some of the content within the markup itself. So there are various ways this happened for different HTML elements. And this slide is showing some of the more common elements to see how those names get set. So, and I'm just going to start in the upper left. And for example, input elements can get their accessible name a couple different ways, and there's oftentimes multiple ways to get names set. This first one with inputs shows that, for example, the input has an ID, fname, and above it there's a label input that has a for attribute, and that for attribute actually just points to that ID for the input. So the input knows that its name is first name right above it. Another way to do that is actually just to have the label element wrap the input along with some text, like you see in the second example. Buttons can have been named set a couple different ways. If an input is set as a submit button or a submit type or a button type, can just get this name from its value. Or if you use a button element, just the actual text within that button element, it's going to give it its accessible name. Form groups, so it's something you might use when you start to group related form controls on a form. They get their name from what's called the legend element, which needs to be the first child of that field set element. And that's going to give that whole group of form controls a name for assistive technology users. And tables are kind of similar. They have a caption element that can be used to give a table a name. And then lastly, images have a few different ways to get their name set. One that's pretty common is by using an alt attribute, just be able to give a text equivalent that really describes kind of what that image is communicating on the screen and what function it has in some cases. So as you saw earlier, there's some additional elements that rely on, there's a couple other techniques that you can use. So in cases where you're adding additional roles like the tabs we saw earlier or dialogues that can be on the screen, these elements can be named with a couple different techniques. And this one that's on the screen now, which is it's adding an ARIA label attribute, is an attribute you can use to on certain elements that have roles like you see here. And ARIA, if you're not familiar with it, stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's kind of an add-on to HTML a little bit to help supplement some of the information that HTML doesn't provide, but ARIA can provide for assistive technologies around here. So this is a case where you want to use ARIA label when the text, like the actual label text, is not on the screen. So in this example, there's actually 3 navigation bars, within a page, which can definitely happen in some cases. So each of those navigation elements can have a ARIA label attribute with a set to be text, like in the case of at the top of the screen, site, or at the bottom, legal or social media. And that's really going to help describe each of those navigation elements, what their name is for assistive technology users. So just setting it directly with ARIA label, when there's really nothing on the screen that kind of gives it its own label. The other way to name an element is with ARIA labeled by, and this technique uses text that's already on the screen as a way to name an element. So in this example, the heading for this dialog is already on the screen, edit contact details. You can see it over here on the right. And how this works is that heading, that H2 element, has an ID set to dialog heading. And so what ARIA labeled by does is on the element that has the role that you want to name, in this case, role equals dialog, you can set the ARIA labeled by to the ID of the heading that's already on the page. And so generally, if you actually have an option to choose between the two, you typically want to prefer this technique, ARIA labeled by, because one, you're not duplicating content, you're not having to write labels twice, maintain them twice. It's also available then for search engines to crawl and for browser tools, so browser translation tools, find tools. It's going to be there on the screen for those already. And lastly, the ARIA label by attribute can be used in some cases where you need to make a name unique and descriptive. So this attribute can actually accept multiple IDs that are separated by a white space. So, and what that does is it'll take those two IDs, it'll grab those two strings, and it'll concatenate them together to create the name of the element. So in this example here, you can see there's a couple of help buttons that are on the screen. And so in the code, the button itself has both, has ARIA label and ARIA labeled by. So if you look at the ARIA labeled by, it has two IDs, help 1 and call head 4. So help 1 is help 4, call head 4 is status. You can see at the top there. So the name is actually then going to be created by putting those two together, help 4 status button. Similarly, the projected amount button, which is next to it, could be built the same way. So someone who is using assistive technology is going to have really descriptive and unique names for those, not just hear help or help button and not know what it's for. So some of you thinking about this last slides might have be asking yourself this and kind of wondering, well, which name wins, right? There's a lot of different ways to set an accessible name. Maybe like in the last example, multiple are used at once. Well, there's actually a calculation for this. That user agents like browsers use to figure out what's the name of a particular element. So, and I'm not going to go into every step of the calculation, but this is kind of the short version. So essentially, ARIA labeled by always wins, and then ARIA label, and then there's a variety of kind of HTML methods and fallbacks. I've included the link to kind of that calculation if you want to take a look and get into the details there, or if you need to have reference for it, the situation comes up, it can be pretty handy to understand how those work. The other way, thing that's handy to know is browser inspection tools actually let you see this. They can give you kind of a peek into what it's creating for the accessibility DOM. So typically you can right click in your browser on an element and pull up the inspection tools. And a lot of times this is a case from Chrome. We can see on the bottom right where there's typically like an accessibility tab in there. And if you look into it and you have that element selected, it's going to show you there in the middle kind of how it's computing the name. So you can see in this case, this is a tab actually from the BB Dave's website. And it's calculating, there's not ARIA label by set, there's not an ARIA label set, there's some content there that it's using for the name of that particular tab. So it's pretty handy. You just want to check to make sure what you're coding is what you expect and that the browser is interpreting it and calculating the name like you would expect. So now that you know which elements need names and you know a little bit how to set them in your markup, I want to talk a little about how to write and choose good labels and names that people can understand and really use effectively. So first best practice is just to match or to use the same visual label. This is helpful for voice control users, like we saw with Rod, who can just say click and then the name of the element. And it's helpful for people who use text to speech. So when they're looking at the screen, can kind of see it, it really helps them understand if it says the same thing that they're seeing, not something different. So don't use different labels, like in this case here. It's submit, it's not send to client. Similarly, if you're going to add maybe just some additional information to a label to maybe give it a little more context, like in the second example, where this is really like the search for the entire site versus maybe there's a search box or search button in a different part of the page, and you want to make that clear to someone who's using the page. You want to make sure you include the label, the visual label, in the name of the element. So not find an entire site, but really use search entire site. So you have that match between the visual label and then the accessible name. And lastly, when you do use icons, and those are communicating something kind of meaningful and needed for the button, I'm going to go ahead and add that in to your label. So you can see in this case here, that plus sign is really saying something you might need to add an assignment. So you want to make sure you include that in your label as well. Next best practice is to not include the name of the element. So elements roles are programmatically there. They're communicated to assistive technology just by default. So in this first case, you don't want to, like if you have an edit button like this, name it edit button, because what a screen reader user is going to hear is edit button. And in the second example, similarly, if you have a navigation element, and this is all about kind of help resources, you don't want to name it help resources navigation, because they're going to hear help resources navigation. So hearing that over and over can be a little bit annoying. Also takes some slightly more time, especially over and over as they're using web page applications. So just a good practice not to do. Next best practice is to consider the context and really think about making labels unique and descriptive, and the name is unique and descriptive. So because screen reader users can navigate a page using multiple strategies and methods, including be able to they can pull up and just go through all the list of links, all the form controls, all the landmarks, all the headings, just one after another. Having them be unique and descriptive is really helpful, so they can understand what they do in that context. So in this case, oftentimes you have a list with buttons, and these all might be edit buttons. So instead of just being edit, really want to include the context. So edit class year, edit dinner selection. Similarly, with list of links, like in the bottom example here, where you have sign up now, we just want to hear sign up now over and over. There's a couple different examples here on the right that this can be done, but adding in that context is really that general principle. So you can do that with an ARIA label, just adding in sign up for what it's about. If there's context, like in this case with volunteering at the kids saving the rainforest. Or another technique for doing this is to actually have that text in the link itself. So sign up for now for volunteers at Kids Saving the Rainforest, you can see in the lower right, but actually hide that off screen. So maybe it's not there for visual users, but it's going to be there for assistive technology. And this example shows there's a class in SkyUX, a CSS class you can use to do that, to kind of move that off screen. So it's there for assistive technology users, but it's not going to be there visually. So this is pretty common in many pages that have repeating actions. So in this example here, there are multiple edit buttons. You can see on the screen kind of pointed to in the purple color. And there are also other sets of buttons like move and expand that are repeated. So for a screen reader user that encounters these and really pulls up, let's say, for example, all the form controls to go through when they're trying to go do something, they're going to have a hard time differentiating them and understanding what they apply to when all they see is edit menu pop-up or edit menu pop-up or edit button. So there's many buttons that have similar names. It's pretty hard to act on them when they don't have that context. And then lastly, I just want to go through kind of a few more best practices for user-friendly accessible names. The first 2 points here are just similar to web content that you might put together and write elsewhere. You just want to think about being consistent with your labels, or sorry, being concise with your labels and names, and putting the most meaningful and important words first. Especially if you have verbs like edit and delete, and leading with those words first, so we can understand what the function is. And the next one is really about thinking about naming based on the function or purpose, and not naming based on kind of location or visual description, which isn't really as helpful. I think about, is it important to know that this is the left navigation or top navigation versus what is the actual navigation in terms of content that this has. And then the last two are really about helping the screen reader to help read out the content most effectively. So start names with capital letters. This actually helps screen readers with the inflection and how they read out those words. And then don't end with a period because they're not sentences. Awesome. So gone through a lot there, and that really covers kind of like the how-to for labels and names. And next, I was going to shift a little bit to how SkyUX can help make accessible names even potentially a little bit easier. So now that you know how all the rest of that works, so I'm going to get into how the Blackbaud design system and its Angular component library in particular can help out, or help you do some of this if you're using it. So first, there are some components where we built accessible names in by default. So there's really nothing to do. This is possible in some places because the meaning is the same regardless of the context. So for a component that you see up in the upper left here, like the status indicator that has kind of an icon on the left, really that icon is a text equivalent of error. So every time that comes on the screen, it's going to have a name of error, which is pretty handy. Similarly, the alert component has some options. It could be that icon can mean warning, it could mean caution. There's some choices that you can make using the component library there. And wait, when wait's on the screen, assistive technology users are going to hear loading or loading complete when that goes away. And there's lots of places where this is also just built into components. So when you set the content that's displayed, especially for components, there's the potential where there's multiple of them on the screen at one time. Really, for example, like with these toasts and tokens, with the close buttons, added in that context. So the close toast message gets added to the button, so it's clear what that closes. And for things like tokens, where there's likely multiple, that remove button gets the label added to it. So remove red, remove black, etc. That just happens by default. And then so for elements that should be named that I covered earlier, they might have kind of additional roles even beyond what's in HTML, like dialogues, tabs in this example. The components ensure that when you set the visible label via an input or just by having that content in the markup itself, it's setting the accessible name correctly for you in the accessibility DOM. So a couple of examples for this. The modal component, it's going to use the heading at the top to create the name for the dialogue role element. And then vertical tabs, section form component, those all have tabs in them. And again, those will have their names set just by using and setting those set in the component itself. Oops. There we go. And calling it just a new feature here a little bit. So this is also starting to pop up with some of our form controls where label text can be an input as well as heading text, and those get set automatically for their labels. And what's cool about this is started to build in some accelerators for unique and descriptive names. So once a label text is set for a particular component, you just set it once, and it's automatically going to go ahead and set the context for example, help buttons, which is a common case where user assistance can be needed for forms. So you set the label text and the help popover content, it's automatically going to go ahead and build those button names for you behind the scenes to make those unique. And that's really a idea that started to make its way into a few more components as well. So we started to build these kind of accelerators to help assistive technology users get these unique and descriptive names. Often the case where the kind of a UI elements, visual labels are understood by their context. So some other examples where this is happening already today is with boxes or tree view or the repeater list. So like in the case of the repeater list down here at the bottom, when you include a context menu in that list, it's automatically going to build that accessible name for you with what's in the list. So context menu for fellowship point in this example, or box does the same thing. There's also a new input on the tile component called tile name. And it's doing some of the same things behind the scenes, which is cool. So it's set that once, it's going to go ahead and set the button names to be unique. Because when you have multiple tiles, you want to know, which settings is this for? Is this note settings? There's this some other settings button on the page. Same thing with the move button. It's going to make that unique. It's not all built in along the way. So there's support for setting the context yourself. So one of the main cases of this we saw before, the system, in some cases, the design system can't know that maybe this button is being used on a page and there's multiple with the same name. So in those cases, like with the Sky drop-down button that you see as the edit button here, there's an input for that for you to be able to go ahead and make that unique on your own. Or similarly for buttons. So in the case of like having multiple edit buttons, you're going to need to go ahead and use that ARIA label by technique that I went over earlier to set that button's name to edit solicit codes in the example that's called out here. That's not something that can happen automatically, but there is support for it. So now we're almost at time. So just a quick take home here at the end, and we'll see. I don't know if I have a minute or two for questions, but remember the second interface. set those roles, the names, and the properties and states in your markup. And when you do that, it's going to make your application a lot more accessible for people using assistive technologies. And remember to name those interactive and wayfinding elements, and think about how you can write good names. Make sure they're unique and descriptive on the page, be concise, don't include the element's name, and don't reference visual characteristics. So thanks for joining me, and I'm going to hand it over to Nichols to wrap us up.
No questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. I don't know if
no questions at all.
Bringing over the chat.
Yeah. Great job.
Cool. Well, yeah, if anyone does have questions, feel free to send me a note. There's my email. Happy to chat about this, or if you have any feedback on SkyUX further, I work on that as well. So thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thank you.